Hello, everybody. This is Damien Fogarty here speaking from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I'm presenting tonight the scouting report on the Ghana team and specifically the Ghana Renal Registry, our first annual report by Vincent Buema and colleagues. Now, before we get into the details, it is important to set the context here in terms of the aims first of a registry. So let's jump ahead to that and consider that the main aims of renal registries are to enable clinicians to easily compile and review aggregate data for comparative benchmarking against agreed standards. And probably one of the most important things early on is the activity, and we'll come back to that. But obviously, as the registries develop, modalities of treatment, outcomes for patients, and markers of care can be collected and analysed to help improve quality and safety for our patients. And more advanced things can, of course, be done with reported outcomes and experiences. And I'm going to take as an arch exemplar the registry I'm most familiar with, the UK Renal Registry, which I had many years association with. And it's I suppose birth started in the 1990s when the idea was first mooted, and the first report in 95 had only 6 units. By the time I probably was getting involved, there was full coverage of the UK with 71 units. And really this slide summarizes in that time period, particularly in the last 10 years, the phenomenal work that has spun out of the registry with research, cohort studies, randomized controlled trial support, quality improvement, rare disease registry. And the last point, which we often forget, but is most important to renal services, planning and policy making. And I would point you towards the fantastic history of the UK Renal Registry at the bottom reference. So the planning and policy can really be best summarized by this slide. And this actually reflects one of the 3 humble papers, I would call them, that preceded, if you like, the UK Renal Registry. And they were published this time 32 years ago and shone a light on the lack of dialysis provision in the UK in particular. So this particular study was from Terry Feast and colleagues in Exeter, but my predecessor, Molly McGeown, had a similar paper from Belfast and colleagues in Manchester. And you'll see that they highlighted the lack of dialysis numbers. This is patients per million population that were starting dialysis or getting a transplant, rare as it was in those days, rising from 20 per million to 55 per million in the 80s. Now, I suppose this one graphic highlights just the impact these simple registry type studies had. They were counting the numbers of patients that could have benefited from dialysis. In the next 5 to 10 years, there was a massive upsurge in the funding and provision of dialysis across the UK, as highlighted in the green arrow and green line here. This is the power of a simple registry study. Let's move now to think about Ghana, a West African country sandwiched between the Ivory Coast and Togo, but with an interesting colonial past. It achieved independence from its history as the British Gold Coast in 1957, and its population of 30 million, or in an area about the size of Michigan or indeed the United Kingdom, ironically. But to be fair to our colonial ancestors, they did leave some good, useful infrastructure with respect to education and a rudimentary healthcare system. And now Ghana has one of the most promising economies in Africa. And this is shown here with the GDP rising, particularly over the last 30 years. So with that, as you would expect, a rising life expectancy, now going above 60 years for the country, but notable that the pyramid of age is still very different from what we're used to in the Western countries. So that leads us to the submitted article, the Ghana Renal Registry, first annual report by Vincent Boema and colleagues from the University of Ghana in Accra. And to summarize their work in a few slides, they performed a web-based survey with a database developed in South Africa and collect the usual variables as outlined here. Interestingly, only 5 of the 16 regions in Ghana have dialysis centres, and all of the trained nephrologists, few as there are based in 2 teaching hospitals and supervise dialysis rather remotely. So the main findings are in the last 2 points. There were 201 patients who started kidney replacement therapy for the first time in 2017, an incidence rate of 6.9 per million population. And keep in mind the incidence rate I showed you from the early registry studies in the UK 30 years ago, rising from 50 to 80 per million population. As such, the prevalent number of patients per million population in Ghana has now been documented for the first time as 23.6 per million population. But this estimated ESRD incidence is actually well below their estimated incidence of 239 new patients per million population. So as such, their first registry has highlighted that only 2.9% of patients needing kidney replacement therapy are being treated. This is a phenomenally important piece of work. And highlighted here with a little bit of detail on the causes of kidney disease, and not unexpectedly, hypertension, diabetic nephropathy, dominating uncertain causes, and rarer causes that you would expect in Africa, being more common, of course, than we would see in Europe and the US. So I'm going to finish here, but in summary, I put it to you that this simple report, reflecting teamwork and focused hard work and training, provides a pivotal piece of evidence to help secure much needed expansion of the renal services in Ghana. And in the competition of what matters to renal healthcare, namely providing kidney replacement therapy, surely this has to be the equivalent in football terms of Brazil, maybe Germany, maybe Italy, perhaps even all 3 added together. The simple, effective work may just transform Ghana and its renal services. Thank you for your interest.